us on Cool, 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 a podcast that explores intersections of inspiring technology, fascinating people, captivating stories, or a combo of all three. So get ready to embrace your inner cool kid as we go behind the scenes with today's innovators and storytellers. I'm your host, Cameron Kitt, founder of Yo-Yos, a documentary storytelling company. And today I have the privilege of chatting with Brett Davidson, who's the founder of Wingseed and a leader in the world of narrative change. Thanks for coming, Brett, and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I reached out to you because of something you published that really blew my mind. And so you're focused on more than just documentary, but you often have worked with nonprofits and big organizations on helping drive impact with how they're telling their stories. Can you just tell me a story of a group you worked with that really stands out in your mind?
Oh, so many. But actually just have come back from a week in Ghana where I was working with the Aspen Institute's Global Innovators Group. And they have a fellowship called the West Africa Impact Fellowship. So I was working with 10 fellows from 10 different West African countries and coaching them and telling their stories. So that was really inspiring because these are people who are trying to change things from, reducing maternal mortality in Nigeria to encouraging growth, cultivation of indigenous plants in Niger, and all sorts of other things. And, these are really inspiring young people, someone in Ghana trying to make sure people can have their health records be accessible, no matter where they go, so that they have continuity of care. So helping people, identify and tell their personal stories, which was fantastic. And it culminated in an event on the Friday where a lot of leaders from the region were invited, and it was amazing to see these young people get up and tell their stories and move the audience.
Wow. So that must feel really good to
Yeah, it
people.
really does. Yeah, absolutely.
So like what was, if you don't, am I allowed to ask, would you mind sharing one of the stories that stood out to you?
Yeah, so one of the people is from, her name is Fanny Taylor Diggs. She's from Liberia, and her um, story is of getting her period and then, and not knowing what was happening, and then realizing that many girls in Liberia don't have access to the kind of products that she would have access to. Then she did some research and found that, the people who run the kind of businesses producing period products are kind of generally foreign men, and women are not profiting from the industry. So she wants to make sure young women and girls have access to hygiene products for menstrual care and menstrual health, but that also women can profit from the business, and it's not so she has a whole amazing idea for creating that business in Liberia. So she got up and told her story, and she was incredibly powerful, and all the women in the room were cheering for her at the end.
That's great. Have you seen Period End of Sentence, that doc?
I haven't, no.
But yeah, it's like that idea of matching women's financial security with creating, selling period products, like that there's a double fold win, and like you can empower women to help other women and have them make money, right? Yeah, and so Brett, your job is to help make sure that stories are coming all the way through and reaching audiences. Can you just tell me more of like what you do in a broad sense?
Yeah, well, it's realizing the power of story. I think we've long ago realized that just giving people information is not enough to change things, and that we as human beings think in terms of stories. It's how we make sense of the world, and so it's really important to use stories to communicate and help people understand the issues we work on. Stories are incredibly powerful in conveying a lot of information in a short package, so they get facts across. They also have emotional content. They also, can contain all sorts of other things. Tell us the history, give us an explanation, all sorts of things, and do it in, as I say, in a very efficient way. And so, unless we are really harnessing the power of stories, we're not really communicating as effectively as we could.
Yeah, stats tell, stories sell, right?
Exactly.
Statistics don't matter to my brain unless I'm actually emotionally attached. So your job is to help pull. I mean, I feel like we have similar roles then, because my job is always like, what's the specific? Give me an example, right? Like what I just asked. Like, okay, tell me about that girl. What's her life like? Like, what does it mean when you don't have pads? Does it mean you have to stay home from school? Like, what does that look like? Because I think the problem is that my brain prefers abstraction, so it doesn't have to engage with the concepts. Like, engaging means burning more calories, and like if I can just like write it off as not directly important to me, then I don't have to think about it. Right? And there's a lot of important things in the world that we're supposed to care about. And so it's like the battle for my heart is always on, and I guess my wallet.
Yeah, and it's also about, it's not only about issues and connecting with issues, it's about connecting with people. You don't connect with an issue really, you connect with people, and stories help us introduce us to people and make us care about people. So I think
Hmm.
that's really important. And you made an important point, and I think the place where I really realized the importance of storytelling was in my early career, where I was working in broadcasting in South Africa. So I anchored a sort of drive time current affairs show, and I used to interview a lot of people from nonprofits, and they would talk in that kind of abstract language, right? Talk about empowerment and um, all sorts of things, giving voice to the voiceless, whatever it was. But it was very high level abstract language, and I struggled to understand, and I'm sure the listeners also struggled to understand what exactly they were talking about. And so it's really when you get to tell a story and you tell about something concrete that people really get it, and I think that's really important. Um,
Yeah, do you think it's because of like grant language that people who work in nonprofits tend to talk in more like abstract phrases? Like that they're used to writing like briefs, documents, and applications and reports. And so they're talking about, the long-term effect of reproductive right care for women. And like at the end of the day, yeah, my brain just doesn't really hear that. Like it does, like that doesn't connect. It's like when I hear how far away Saturn is, it doesn't really, it's like, okay, like that's really far. I don't know. Right. Yeah. So that's your job. You're essentially a consultant working with these groups to say, hey, let's talk about, Maria's experience. Where can we put that? How can we highlight that? Can we make a video? Can we make a blog post about it? Is that right? Can you like tell me a little more?
Yeah, but I think look, I'm just as guilty as anyone else of talking in those abstract terms, because I've become quite involved in the world of nonprofits, and so I use that language as well. And my husband also tells me that I am just as bad as anyone else, with my NGO speak. Um, but I think it's because we live in a world, we've gone through a journey of learning about things. We don't realize that the process we went through was a process of learning and discovering, and then we work in a world where we use this jargon, these abstractions, because the people around us understand what we're talking about. But we forget that other people don't. Other people haven't gone on that journey, and we forget the journey that we had to go on to learn that stuff. And so we use that language, and it's efficient because it's a shorthand for we can't always describe everyone's individual situation. We need to describe general things. We need to describe systems. But that's not how people connect with issues. That's not how people understand the world. When we're talking to friends and so on, we mix between facts and figures and telling people anecdotes and stories, and that's just how we talk. And so unless we engage in that language and make an effort to do that, we're really limiting our impact. um, I would say this, stories also carry dangers. It's not again, like, stories are not just um, good. If you tell one story that moves people, but it's not representative, or it's a distorted image of what most people experience, then that can really lead people down the wrong kind of path when it comes to policy. So how do you make
Uh-huh.
yeah, so we've had cases where, for example, something happens. I mean, for example, a story about a migrant in this country maybe committing a crime, true or untrue, can create all sorts of misguided policies because it's an isolated incident, it's not representative, and so on and so forth. We've seen stories used and abused as
Hmm.
well. So we need to make sure that our storytelling is ethical, that our stories are representative of the real problem, and so on and so
Mm.
forth. So I think that's also, there's stories can also be extractive. We often ask people who are suffering from uh, abuse, or discrimination, racism, to tell their stories and sort of rehash their trauma, and that's also kind of extractive and not healthy. So how do we use storytelling in a way that is not those things, but actually helps people, have a voice that actually directs people in the way that is, kind of in conformity with our values and with the world we want to see.
Yeah, I mean, my first question is, okay, how do you make sure storytelling is ethical? My first gut reaction is like, well, tell more than one, I guess, like multiple stories. And there's this in this report, this it was an article, it was like a scientific paper almost that you wrote that I found. You mentioned a organization that I'm trying to find. Yeah. For GFAN, Global Fund Advocates Network, about their storytelling around, I think it was around AIDS, correct? They had like 200 videos of people's experience with HIV. And like that, I'm assuming that helps maybe counteract the idea of unethical storytelling. Tell me more about
Yeah,
that.
so yeah, exactly. So, ensure that there are multiple stories, ensure that the people who tell stories are also a part of the, deciding on the policies. I think the other thing that can happen is we call people in to tell their stories, and then we let them leave the room, and then, we say, well, thank you very much, and then we'll decide what the policy is, instead of actually, ensuring that the people impacted, the storytellers, are also part of what, the policy discussions. That's really important. And make sure, when we did our storytelling trainings, when I was working at Open Society Foundations, everyone in the room has to tell a story. So whether you're the funder, whether you're the grantee, whatever it is, you tell your story. So again, that kind of levels the playing field. It's like we're all here to tell stories. We're all here to look at the facts. We're all here to debate on policy. We're not fixing anyone in one particular role. I think that's really important. Oh, I'm not hearing you now. No.
Sorry, I was
Oh,
just
there we go.
chatting on mute. I was
That's
saying
okay.
I have a really great quote from you, which is like from your article, Storytelling and Evidence-Based Policy. Narrative is a key means through which people organize and make sense of reality and engage in reasoned argument, which is like kind of pointing back to this idea that like that's how our brains gather and absorb information.
Mhm.
Like when we lived in tribes, if you're going to tell me like how to, I need to hear stories to understand. And still today, we still believe individual people information as opposed, we actually believe it's stronger when it's given from someone else's voice than from reading it. So I think that speaks a little bit to like the political state. But the truth is, I notice it in my own life. Like when a friend tells me the news, like I can feel it be believed more strongly than when I read it. Um, but yeah, that maybe comes back to this idea of like ethics. But I just want to pause for a moment and say, this podcast is brought to you by Yo-Yo's You Own Your Own Stories, a documentary storytelling company that demystifies cutting edge technology with emotional human stories. If you've got a cool story to share, we can help you get it out there. Um, so yeah, I honestly, Brett, I just want more stories. Tell me about what it's been like with Wingseed, and tell me more people, like more different organizations you've worked with, and what are some of the issues that you've helped different groups overcome when it comes to their reticence to storytelling.
Well, again, I'm not sure everyone's reticent about storytelling, but I think people don't necessarily know how to do it best. Just often need the skills. I think most people now kind of understand that storytelling is important. So through Wingseed, one of the organizations I work for is called IRIS, the International Resource for Impact and Storytelling. Um, and my role there is lead for narrative field building. And I was just with Iris. I was at the Skull World Forum 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago, and so many people came up to us and said, "Can you help us with storytelling? Can you help us with storytelling?" So I think people really, really recognize the importance and really need to learn the skills. And so some of the things we do with at Iris is connect professional storytellers, so filmmakers like you, producers, artists, and with people who are working on issues, and help them tell their stories. So it's not only helping individuals who are the experts to tell their own personal story, but how can we pair issue experts and funders with people who are skilled at storytelling, and let the storytellers lead. I think often people in issue-based organizations want to kind of control the story and make sure that it covers their talking points and so on. But often the most powerful stories are the one that perhaps are a little more complex, that maybe don't necessarily toe the organizational line, that present people in their full humanity and complexity. And sometimes those stories are most powerful, but often people in organizations are more uncomfortable with those stories because they're less easy to control, right? So I think is how do we help people understand that, and become comfortable with that and facilitate those relationships. So that's one of the things we do. So with Iris, we've worked on things like sexual health and rights for women in Kenya. There's a project we worked on, we're looking at what media coverage is right now, and then with a great filmmaker called Merit Mandefro, who led a writers' room with, to work with some Kenyan writers and filmmakers and comedians to develop new kinds of stories. Um, what else did we do? Um, there's a great organization called Puentes that we collaborate with, led by Monica Roa. They work across Latin America to tell new kinds of stories. For example, stories about family. We have all this, the kind of right wing has kind of tried to co-opt the idea of family, right, for their values. And so Pointis is saying, no, the idea of family is important to everyone, and we need to tell stories about families that really embody progressive values. So that's one of the things they do, for example. And they're
It's amazing.
fantastic organizations. Other organizations, Toriba in Brazil, which is trying to tell stories of the future and help us imagine a new and better future. So that's also
Hmm.
important. How do we tell stories that that don't exist now, but stories that help us imagine a new and better future? Thomas
Hmm.
Coombs, who he leads a thing called Hope-Based Communication, based in Berlin. How do we tell stories of hope? So these are amazing people who are using the power of narrative and storytelling to try and bring about change.
Amazing. And I'm hearing like I really, of course, like hearing you say connecting them with the story, with the filmmakers, the storytellers, the writers, right? Who are naturally good at it. That's I feel like I spend a lot of time saying that same thing, like, hey, let me put my skills to use. And a lot of the work that I do is, aiming at say film festivals or
Mm.
things that can get audiences to watch it. Or a lot of times people are absorbing things through YouTube. And so I do tend to think of everything through the lens of video and film. I mean, of course, there's a lot of actual benefit that's coming from TikTok too, of like the direct
Absolutely.
one-to-one storytelling that's happening without that filter. I'm really glad you mentioned this idea of the push-pull between our talking points and the film being good, right? Like sometimes the edit can actually erase the quality of the story that makes it really good. And so that's the hard part, is like, please trust the filmmaker making something that might feel a little edgy is actually going to have a bigger impact. And that's just like one of the hardest things in my work is I want the clients to own the story, but I also want them to believe that leaving the weird part in is going to be good, right? Like, or I think sometimes what I hear a lot is this idea that specificity, it would turn people off, and I think that's my biggest issue with maybe not marketers, but like the what kind of idea of comms is that everything has to be like very generalized to be applicable. And it's like in my experience, and I'm not the perfect expert, my experience, a very specific story about a Kenyan woman, and if I can get details about her life, if she's not the exact same as me, the more I know about her, like if she has like, I don't know, COPD or something, I actually will relate to her more if I know more about her, even if it's not relevant to me. Can you talk to that, Brett, a little bit?
Yeah, it's really one of the, I guess, the paradoxes of storytelling. But you're absolutely right there. The more specific you can get, the more individual can get. In a strange way, the much more universal it is as well, right? And you're right. The closer you can get to a person and their individual specific story, the more likely you are to see yourself in something of that story. Absolutely. And I guess that's one of the things to struggle to get people to understand in telling stories, right? Because you want to have something more general, but actually the more specific, the better, because you're absolutely right. Um,
Oh.
when we see ourselves in other people, and again, like if you use language of, I keep telling people, and I learned this from an organization called Narrative, who I worked with in telling stories. That can you talk about the specific sensory details, like what did you see
Mhm.
in that
Mhm.
room, what did the room look like, what clothing was the person wearing, what were the colors of the clothing, get down to that level of specificity, because that's what makes the story come alive, and then we can feel like we're in the room with the person and we can experience it. But if I tell you, oh, I felt this emotion, that becomes a much more abstract feeling. If you say I'm sad, okay, I believe you, but I'm not feeling the sadness. But if you take me into the situation and help me experience what you experienced, then I will feel the sadness you felt. So that's
And
the
I'll
power
probably
of
remember it
specific
too,
story. Exactly. Yeah.
right?
Exactly.
Because
Yeah.
the more distinct the details and the painting of the picture and the smell of the room, the more my brain will latch on to those unique. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I feel like both of what we're doing is kind of working around human neuroscience. Like this, how does the brain gather and it's like we're very like weird detail oriented. So Brett, if you had to predict, if we were thinking about a crystal ball, if you were like a fortune teller, what would you say is your biggest prediction for the future of storytelling in the NGO world?
Hmm. I have no idea. I mean, but I think to get back to your um, one of the themes of your podcast around technology, I think we're confronted with all sorts of new technology, AI to be specific, and I think what we're going to have to grapple with is how do we, are there ways to utilize this tool? How do we use it ethically? um, we talked about extraction, and I think AI and other technological platforms create so much more potential for extraction and surveillance. So how do we how do we, encounter that? How do we maybe regulate and limit that while cultivating the benefits? And I think there are certainly benefits. It maybe enables us to do much more useful audience research that would have been too expensive, maybe enables us to connect with audiences we wouldn't have been able to connect with before. So
Hmm.
I think, but I just think we're going to have to start grappling with and figure out, what do we want from this? How can we, intervene also to tell stories about technology that, make it more humane? I think one of the things that frustrates me about the storytelling or the narratives about AI and other technologies, if everything that's happening is just inevitable, that we can't do anything about it. But technology is about people. We can decide what we want to do with technology. We can decide what the limits should be, what the possibilities should be. So I think we need to tell more stories about that. Um,
Hmm.
I think another of these fellows that I talked about working with 2 weeks ago in Ghana is Victoria Saki, and she's working on making sure people have access to their health records and digital health records so that people can, get quality care wherever they go. But she had this fantastic remark, which was what we have to bring a technology closer to people, not people closer to technology, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which I think is really important. And so how do we tell stories about technology, and how do we use technology for storytelling that centers people and or centers life, I would say, of all sorts, rather than foregrounding the technology itself.
Yeah. I think with AI, there's a lot of excitement and also a lot of fear,
Yeah.
right? That I think from a sci-fi filmmaker standpoint, I love it. Like I think enabling us to like shorten production time and create more things, and there's a lot of creativity support. But I think there's a lot of streamlining benefits for storytelling. But I wonder from like a writing perspective. Yeah, I mean, so it sounds like what I'm hearing is that NGOs can start using AI to help better stories, but the question is, are you relying on the AI to make it human, or are you humanizing what you're using, I guess. Can you give me an example of how you've seen an organization start using AI in storytelling?
Yeah, not one doesn't really come to mind right now. I know of well, I don't. Let me say. There's a group called the Futures Narrative Lab in the UK, and I think they're just looking at that now. I don't know, if they've really used it yet. They're certainly looking at possibilities for that. Um,
Because yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
no, go ahead. Yeah.
Because like what comes to mind for me is just like B-roll or like imagery over audio, right? Like if we have a lot of audio and you don't have any B-roll to go over it, people can
Mm,
generate video really easily that can kind of be like the substrate for the audio so that it can get out there. Um, like maybe that's cheaper. That's the first thing that comes to mind is like if you can just make more, like when I come back to this idea of like the 200 videos of people's experience with HIV, right? That like wealth, that huge content library was like really important. But if you don't have video and you just have audio, maybe you could, I don't know, that's use AI to do that. But I also am I see a lot of fear in the filmmaker world of like the idea of being replaced,
mm.
right? But yeah, Brett, it's just absolutely fantastic, like what you do, and I think yeah, you and I are on the exact same team of like pro story. So if you could have everybody listening to this podcast do one thing, what would it be?
You know, think about it, and like you find ways to use stories. Don't forget about the power of storytelling.
Hmm.
Just so if I can go back to the
Sure, sure,
discussion
sure.
of AI, I think another great organization doing work is Witness, who are really looking at
Oh,
the
Al
potential
Jazeera.
for. No, it's a nonprofit called Witness, and I think they're based in Brooklyn. But they're looking at the
Oh,
potential of AI for creating deep fakes and so on, and the dangers around that, and they're
yeah,
educating people into how what you need to do policy wise and otherwise to because like, obviously that's the other danger around using AI for imagery is that you create fakes that look like the real thing.
I
And so
know.
they're really looking into that and how do we grapple with that. Sam Gregory leads that organization. He's doing
Because
really
that's
great work.
like ethics wise, that's where storytelling could be like a total propaganda machine that could
Mm.
work against a lot of organizations and like spread the wrong information by making it look like a local elected official is saying something that they're not,
Yeah,
right.
all sorts of stuff, right? Yeah.
It's
Um,
That's terrifying.
yeah. But one thing I would say is, and you mentioned sci-fi, find the writers, find the sci-fi writers, find the artists, who are connected. It doesn't have to be, someone world famous, but in your community, because there are, I mean, all of us, we might not be professional writers or artists, but there's so many people doing that kind of work, and work with those people because it's the artists and the writers and the sci-fi visionaries who are really going to help us create that new vision. And so how can you pair up with them and help them, help them help you in telling your story or telling new kinds of stories?
Find the writers, find the filmmakers, and hire
Exactly.
Brett to do training and education and consulting for your org. So that's it. Thanks for listening to Cool, Cool, Cool. This is episode 26. I'm Cameron Kitt from Yo-Yos. Huge thank you to Brett Davidson from Wingseed for joining us today and sharing his incredible stories. You can check out the show notes to links to his website and our website, of course, and let us know what you thought of the episode on social media using the hashtag CoolCoolCool podcast. Brett, thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much.